The idea that marketing is about more than just a single click, and that the impact of advertising occurs over time and across many exposures is not a new idea. What is new is a scalable way to go beyond that last ad and leverage all the digital touchpoints in a consumer's history to optimize our online campaigns. In this session, we'll review the research that's led to the development of the new conversion reporting standard. We'll provide an overview of the methodology and the reporting, and we'll discuss the implications of the new standard on how media is bought and sold online. Let's start off with just an understanding of how the current last ad standard works today. Right now, most advertisers are measuring some type of ROI event on their website, be it a sale, an online lead, a download of a software, or even just a visit to a specific product page. And what most reporting systems do is they record that action on the advertiser's website and then goes upstream to see if there are any clicks in that user's history. And if there is a click on an ad, that click will get the conversion, will get 100% credit for that conversion. If there's no click, but there is an ad view, then that last ad will get credit for that conversion, that sale, that lead. Now, you don't need to be in the business, in this industry, to recognize that the world is a bit more complex than that last ad. There's much more going on. Our ad campaigns are reaching consumers multiple times across multiple channels and over extended periods of time. And so although that last ad or that last click is useful, the reality is that there's much more engagement, there are many more touch points, and the question then becomes, is there a way for us to actually leverage all these different data points and touch points to help inform what's working, what's not, and ultimately where we should be investing our media dollars? The answer to that question is yes, which I'll get to in the latter half of this presentation. Let's start off by just diving into some of the research that's helped us quantify the reasons why it's so important to go beyond that last ad. The place where we started was this idea that there is some type of cross-channel synergy, and the classic one there is with our search and display advertising. You know, the idea that running multiple channels somehow help each other, and that your banner ads are somehow influencing the results of your search campaign. And that's exactly what we sought out to understand. And so for 11 advertisers, what we did was we took the users who are clicking on their sponsored search ads and put them in one of two buckets. We put them into people, search clickers who were also exposed to display ads from the same advertiser, and search clickers who were not exposed to any banner ads from the same advertiser. And then we compared their downstream behavior in terms of their conversion rates, again, being sales, leads, or some type of ROI event. What we found across the 11 advertisers was that there in fact was a significant lift in terms of that behavior, that search clickers, sponsored search clickers who were also exposed to banner ads had a 22% lift in their conversion rates or their rates of sale versus sponsored search clickers who weren't exposed to any display ads. There certainly was a diversity in results, but overall there was a significant impact. And the interesting thing about this 22%, besides the fact that we can actually start quantifying that now, is thinking about the implications on reporting. You know, because the last ad standard associates 100% credit to just one ad, and it'll associate it to a click if there's a click in the user's history, all of these users who were clicking on sponsored search ads and then subsequently purchasing, you know, those sales were being 100% associated with the search channel, and all those display impressions that are in fact influencing behavior, in this case by about 22%, are not getting that credit for that influential impact that they are making. And so this idea, this very conceptual, very intuitive understanding that multiple channels and the effect across these channels is happening, again, is something that people intuitively believe, but very few people are quantifying, and it certainly right now is not being taken into account in our reporting. Another issue that a lot of media planners grapple with is this idea that we are reaching people across multiple sites with our campaigns. And 8-9 years ago, when we first started studying this issue, when people had slower connections, ad budgets were much smaller. The prevalence of ad networks wasn't as great. When an advertiser bought inventory across 12 different websites, they were largely reaching 12 different unique audiences, and the amount of overlap was relatively small. You fast forward to today, where budgets are much greater, internet connections are much faster, people are spending much more time online, and again, the ad networks have become a very key part of media plans, and the amount of duplication that we are now seeing is very, very large. And whereas before we were able to kind of try and study this by looking at the overlap across two different sites, or the reach of a campaign across two different sites, we're now realizing that overlap is much more organic than that, right? That people are being reached across 2 sites, 3 sites, 4 sites, or more, and the amount of frequency is much greater. And so the first thing that we want to quantify is how often is this happening. And across about 30 advertisers, we aggregated the results and found that for a given advertising campaign, about a third of the reach of that campaign is going to be to users that are reached across multiple sites. For the large Fortune 500 type advertisers whose budgets are much larger, that'll be over 50%. Over half of their reach will be to users across multiple sites. But what's more interesting is when you look at the people who are actually converting, right? The people who are purchasing or downloading software, or even just visiting your website. If you look back in their histories, about 2/3 of those people have actually been reached across multiple sites by your ad campaigns. And again, if you're a large advertiser, the big brand Fortune 500 companies, that goes to 9 out of 10 of the converters will have multiple touch points across multiple sites in their histories. And so that overlap is much greater. And then the impact on frequency is much more dramatic now than it has been in years past, meaning when you're reaching somebody across multiple sites, that group of people, their frequency is actually 4 times higher than the people you're exclusively reaching on individual websites. So the overall learnings are this, is that one, advertisers are reaching consumers across multiple sites. That's especially true for their converters, and that amount of frequency that's being delivered to their converters across multiple sites is quite significant. And again, this is something that wasn't true when advertising first started online, but it's definitely true now, especially with ad budgets becoming double-digit percentages of the overall marketing budget. Again, the implications of this on reporting is real. When you reach a consumer across 3, 4, 5 sites, why is it only one of those sites is actually going to get credit for that user's downstream behavior? It would make sense for each one of those touch points and each one of those sites to get some amount of credit. Maybe not the same, but some amount of credit. And we'll get to that in a bit. Another issue that we wanted to get to was around this idea around navigational search. There was this hypothesis that a lot of people are using search engines and search ads to simply get to the websites that they had already intended on going to. Search engines these days have become so good at what they do, and search ads have become so good at being targeting those people that it's no surprise that for most advertisers, their highest volume sponsored search ad is their own brand name, and those branded search terms do account for the bulk of the sponsored search volume. And so we wanted to measure that and see that across a sample of advertisers, and we also wanted to quantify the repeat visit effect, meaning how many people are maybe use a search ad to get to the advertiser's website the first time, but then take the exact same path that they used the first time to get back to the advertiser's site. Because that's another very striking thing we saw in the search logs, is the amount of repeat visits that took the exact same path that included a sponsored search ad to get back to the advertiser's website. And again, there's a hypothesis that if you retrace your steps, which a lot of people do when they're trying to get back to a website, that a lot of those search ads are simply navigational in terms of getting back to the website. And so that's what we did. We took all the sponsored search clicks associated with a bunch of campaigns across 30 different advertisers, and we segmented them by whether they were branded versus unbranded search terms, and whether they were first-time or repeat visits to the advertiser's website. And what did we find? First off, we found that almost half of the sponsored search clicks were repeat clicks, meaning, again, that same exact path taken multiple times to get back to the advertiser's website. In terms of branded keywords, no surprise, about 60% of the total sponsored search clicks were on branded terms. So the exact brand name of the advertiser or the URL. So toyota.com, www.toyota.com, or just the word Toyota, we would have considered branded terms. And so the intersection of that are clicks on branded search terms, but we're also repeat clicks, right? And so that's actually 36.9% overall of the branded search terms. So over a third of sponsored search clicks, I think, are unarguably navigational in nature. You could take this to the logical extreme and say, hey, 71% of sponsored search clicks are navigational, and that may be somewhat debatable. But the point, whether these are navigational or not navigational, the reason why we're talking about this is not so much whether these are useful or valuable clicks. This study was controversial because I think people thought the implications of this was that we were saying, hey, these clicks are worthless. That's absolutely not the case. Any advertiser wants to make it easier and more convenient for consumers to find their website. And so the strategy of buying these clicks may very well be a great idea. The issue that we have with it is its impact on reporting. Because if a user, clicked on banner ads, were exposed to many banner ads, saw a bunch of rich media ads, witnessed a video ad, right? If there was a rich user history in terms of engagement in that purchase funnel, yet they used they just typed the advertiser's brand name into a search engine and used a sponsored search ad to get to the advertiser's website, all of that engagement, all of those different touch points will completely be obscured and get zero credit for helping to convert that user. And that's the big implication. Search engines have become so good at what they do that there is real danger in obscuring the value of all the other marketing activities that were associated with consumers. So then the question becomes, if you're not going to use the last ad and give that last ad 100% credit, what is a better way? And that's what this concept called engagement mapping is all about. It's this idea that, hey, if we're going to go beyond that last ad, let's do that in a rational, structured, intuitive way. And so if you're going to go beyond the last ad, the first thing that you're going to do is take into account frequency. So if this is a user who saw 8 different ad impressions prior to the conversion event, right, and you're going to use frequency as part of that equation, then you would say, hey, if these different balls represent different impressions and the different colors represent impressions from different sites, the orange site delivered half the frequency and deserves half the credit for the sale. That would be, one very simple way to make the attribution of this conversion a bit more complex than just simply the last ad. But we all know that impressions aren't created equal. So for instance, recency. We know that some of these ads are in closer proximity to the conversion than others, and it's a very intuitive common marketing concept that those should gain more weight and have more impact, and that should be reflected in the credit that they deserve. And since we have a date timestamp with each one of these different touch points, we can factor that into the equation. Another one is ad size. We all know that larger ads certainly cost more, and there are countless brand studies that correlate the impact of the size of an ad with its impact on branding metrics. We know the size of the ads that we're delivering in the digital space. Why not use the ad size to actually weight and impact how much credit is associated with each one of these touch points? And in fact, we can do exactly that. Another one is ad format. So rich media. We know that rich media ads are more impactful than flash ads, and flash ads are typically more impactful than GIF ads. Ad format matters, and that goes not only for rich media but for video. And that can be factored in the equation as well. And we've seen those branding studies as well as behavioral studies that show the differences between different ad formats and how big of impact that can make. I'm not going to go through all these variables, but the point here is that there are very intuitive, very common, very widely accepted marketing variables that we can use to actually weight and change and impact how much credit an individual impression, click, or interaction gets in a user's history. And that's exactly where all of this reporting is going. Because this is data that we've had actually since the beginning of third-party ad serving, since the beginning of log files, yet we've oversimplified the problem by simply giving 100% credit to the last ad. We're now in a position, because the significance of online spends, to actually start attributing this credit much more intelligently than we have in the past. So that's a conceptual overview. To really get a true understanding of how all these different variables impact your conversion model, to get an understanding of how these different dials, you can actually pick which variables you want to be part of your model, and then the importance of each one of those variables. We developed a tool called the Visualizer that helps advertisers play with that and see how different scenarios result in different amounts of credit allocated for each one of the touch points. And this is just a screenshot of that tool. I'm not going to go into it today. There's an entire whole module and demo that I encourage all of you guys listening in to this today to go check out. But the point is that when you go beyond that last ad and start attributing credit to all these different pieces, there is understanding how all these different moving parts work together to ultimately come up with a quantitative result is now available, and there is an actual application that helps you alter different models and look at different scenarios and understand the implications of those. Again, that's a separate module which I won't go into now, but we should talk about how engagement mapping is actionable. Because that's the number one question that I get, is that, okay, we're going to go beyond the last ad. We're going to use all the digital touch points. We're going to make this much more complicated than it ever was before. And the last thing I need is more data, right? I need more insight, more action, less data. And this is both the good news as well as the part of engagement mapping that's somewhat anticlimactic, because what we need as advertisers is a report that a planner buyer can use, that they can pull on a weekly basis or a monthly basis or whatever that cycle is, and see very quickly and easily, based on my ROI, this is where I should spend more, this is where I should spend less. And they largely have that right now based on the last ad. What you're looking at right now is a typical looking report that a planner would use in the middle or at the end of a campaign, where they have sites, they have costs, they have impressions, clicks, they have conversions, some type of ROI event, as I mentioned, and then they're calculating a CPA, or a cost per action. And they can very quickly see, okay, Google's doing fantastic, Drive's doing pretty good. ESPN, not so hot. With engagement mapping, again, with all those fractions of reporting, of credit that's being calculated, all of those fractions of credit will then roll up at the placement, creative, and site level, and actually create a new alternative set of conversion numbers. Right? So in this case, Yahoo, whereas under the last ad model is taking credit for 150 conversions, under engagement mapping is now getting credit for 173 conversions, right? So 15% more conversions. But what's driving that 15% increase are all those fractions. It means that Yahoo is actually reaching people that maybe ESPN got credit for or Google got credit for under the last ad, but those fractions are now contributing to the 173 conversions it's getting under engagement mapping. So the idea here is that, although from a workflow standpoint, it's very simple. There's this conversion column. There's a CPA that's still calculated. You can now do, optimize on the blue numbers instead of the yellow numbers. But what's driving the blue numbers are, again, all of those different variables that we talked about that can and should impact how much credit each one of those touch points get credit for. And so now, whereas Yahoo had a $67 CPA, now has a $58 CPA, may continue to get budget, may be negotiated, all those different things. Whereas maybe at $67, it would simply have been cut off from the buy from any subsequent campaigns. So the interesting thing here is that, again, the lens of engagement mapping is adding all of these other variables, yet the workflow is unimpacted. And if you look at the total line, the 973 conversions under the last ad, that actually matches the 973 conversions under engagement mapping. We're not creating more conversions or taking conversions away. What we're doing is reallocating how, which sites get credit for what amount of conversions, again, based on all those variables that we talked about. Let's finish off with just a quick overview of what the strategic benefits are for agencies and advertisers with going beyond the last ad and with engagement mapping. First off, it brings the strategy back to the business. I've talked to so many agencies and advertisers really where, week after week, month after month, their reporting's conclusion is buy more search, buy more cheap ad network space. Nothing else works. And that conclusion has become so extreme that, media plans look like, a couple of search engines and a couple of ad networks. And everyone's intuition is just screaming that, that can't be the only online advertising that works. It has to be more complex than that. And the oversimplification of our reporting rules really has lended us that conclusion. And so when you go beyond that last ad and you start using an attribution methodology that uses all those touch points, all of a sudden that richness is revealed. And then it's not just about search. It's not just about cheap ad network space. The sponsorships, the rich media, the video, all of those types of ad units are contributing and reaching those converters, and they should get credit. All of a sudden frequency matters, right? In the world of one ad gets credit, frequency is largely waste. And that's how it's seen both on the publisher and advertiser side, is that, if that impression didn't lead to a click or didn't lead to a conversion immediately, it's a waste of media dollars. Again, that's not how advertising works. And now we have a methodology that gives credit to that cumulative effect that we all know happens in the marketplace. This idea of cross-channel synergy is in fact happening. It's quantifiable, and engagement mapping promotes that idea of integrated media planning. And so, if you are a site that is delivering a lot of impressions to people who are clicking on sponsored search ads and then converting, you will do well under the engagement mapping model, whereas you won't do so well under the last ad model. And a lot of those types of buys are right now being cut out of the buy. And so engagement mapping actually highlights those sites where that cross-channel effect is actually happening. Longer consideration windows. One of the byproducts of the last ad model is that people have, to be conservative, cranked down their conversion window, which is the consideration window of a reporting system in terms of how much data or how far back you would look for data to associate to a sale. And because most impressions and clicks, most last ad impressions and clicks happen relatively close to the conversion event, shortening the window really hasn't made a huge impact on advertisers' reporting. But now with engagement mapping, advertisers who have medium to long consideration cycles have incentive to actually open up those windows to capture more of those touch points and have the impression, the click, and the video ad that happened 40 days ago actually get some amount of credit in the entire stream of that user's history. And so again, it's just opening up the window encourages that because advertisers will be able to capture more data and make a better decision because of that. As we talked about before, engagement mapping, it's actionable because it rolls up into reporting. And the numbers look very similar to the numbers that people are using today, even though there's a much more robust, more complex methodology driving those numbers from a day-to-day, how do I make decisions, how do I take action on these numbers. There's no additional cost, no additional workflow, and it's right there available in your on-demand reporting. There's been a huge prevalence of cost per acquisition deals or CPC deals, and those aren't going to go away. They're a great way to build reach. They're a great way to build accountability in media plans. But again, with the last ad model, a lot of the incentives associated with those deals is to simply be the last ad. Not a interesting ad, or not a large ad, or not a rich ad, but just be the last ad. And a lot of those incentives have driven some of the kind of nefarious behaviors that we've heard, in the network space, where one of the strategies is just to spam everyone that you possibly can with a tiny little logo and cross your fingers that you're the last ad prior to that person converting so that you can get credit for it. And so what we've seen is, ad network after ad network, and it's not just the ad networks, all the sites now who are fighting to simply be the last ad rather than creating value and engagement for the advertisers, which is ultimately what we're all shooting for. And so all of a sudden, when you start looking at your campaigns through the engagement mapping lens, publishers then become incentivized to deliver the largest ad units of the richest ad formats more frequently to the converters, more interactions, more clicks, right? And all of those different variables that we talked about, those are things that advertisers want and publishers can and should be incentivized to deliver. And so even with CPA deals, where we had issues around duplication and reaching the same user across 4 different ad networks and then paying 4 times, that issue's been solved with third-party ad serving and making sure you only pay one of those publishers. Now we're moving on to the next phase where you've solved the duplication issue. Now it's about, hey, this ad network probably deserves a third of the bounty. This other publisher deserves a third of the bounty, and maybe the other 2 ad networks split the difference. And so as we move into that phase, you're going to see much more sophistication, much more targeting, and a lot less spray and pray amongst the ad networks. One of the things that is very exciting about this idea of engagement mapping, especially as we talk to traditional advertisers, is, when you talk to a TV guy about the last ad standard and how reporting works, I mean, they just cringe and turn the other way. The last thing that a TV person wants is their ad campaign measured on who clicks on it, and crossing their fingers that last click was the last thing in that user's history before they visited the advertiser's website. That's just not how brand advertising works, and that's not how traditional advertising typically works. But when you start talking about reach, frequency, ad size, recency, ad formats matter. All of a sudden, the traditional advertisers are like, yeah, I mean that makes sense to them. It's those are the currencies in the offline space, and so as we change our ROI and reporting metrics to again measure more of the funnel, the TV, print, offline channels will follow because those types of metrics make sense to them. Finally, the exercise here is not to make people's lives more complex. It's not to dump a bunch of data so that somebody who doesn't exist can analyze it and deliver a report that's that nobody can understand. The idea here is that it's not just the raw log files associated with these converters, although that's the ultimate building blocks. What we're doing is actually applying all of these different variables in a framework and doing the heavy lifting, doing the math, actually calculating the fractions of credit, and then all of that rolling up into reporting that's available to you on a real-time basis. And that ultimately is what makes all of this actionable. It's what ultimately makes all of this useful, and why we believe engagement mapping is going to become the next standard. Just like when we first started measuring and counting impressions, right? Then we started measuring click-throughs, and people were able to use that to optimize their campaigns. Then people replaced that with the last ad conversion metrics, right? Both the click-based conversions and view-based conversions. Now we're moving on to the next one. We're actually going beyond that last ad and associating credit to all the touch points along the purchase funnel. And that's approaching that real promise of the digital space, of the accountability and the ROI that we all love to talk about. And it's again just that next step in the evolution of making this data meaningful and actionable for marketers. So that's the idea behind engagement mapping. There is much more content available. We will see this capability in the Atlas Media Console at the end of summer of 2008. We're in the midst of a beta that involves about 24 of our largest advertisers, and there's a lot of excitement, a lot of more research to come. But it certainly is an issue that I think everyone, especially as the digital marketing space becomes a mainstream marketing channel, it's going to be metrics like these and methodologies like these that help us take things to the next level. So thank you for joining us today, and stay tuned for much, much more.
For more information on engagement mapping, please visit www.atlasinstitute.com and click on the Engagement Mapping tab. Or you can contact us by emailing emap@microsoft.com or by contacting your Atlas representative.